Good morning, Cornerstone. So good to be with you. Is this not a beautiful weekend? Isn't this great weather? So where my wife and I are from, where we spent 35 years of our life, it's snowing today. So I gotta say, I love Arizona. Don't you love Arizona? Well, I need, like last week, if you were here, I need your participation again. So whenever I point at you, like last week, you're gonna say, fail. So we'll try it. Fail. All right, yep, let's try it again. Fail. All right, you got it. Now, just for those that weren't here, the reason we do this is when my children were growing up, when they were in junior high and high school, even now as adults, anytime I would mess up, if I would trip on a curb or fumble my speech or something, they would say, yeah. How many of you remember your very first job you ever had? Raise your hand. You remember the first job you ever had. Now, most of us, if you had that first job, if you can remember that first job, it's probably not a job that you wanted to do the rest of your life, right? Most of you, you had jobs like I did. It was an entry-level job. It was boring. It was maybe disgusting at times. Well, one of my children, my son, he had a job like that. He worked at a burger joint. He was the new guy, so he was low man on the totem pole. So he got the worst of the worst tasks. He had to clean out the grease traps. One time they asked him to clean the gum off the bottom of tables. Apparently, some people go to restaurants and they don't spit their gum in the garbage. They don't put their gum in a napkin and throw it away. They just go and then stick it on the bottom of the table. Now, my son informed me that once the gum has been sticking there for a while, it's like cement. It's like it's super glued on the bottom. So my son said he got on his back. He had to have a sharp knife, and he's working to get this gum off the bottom of the table. Now, what you should know about my son is he's a mouth breather. Yeah, you're ahead of me a little bit on the story, but yeah, he doesn't breathe through his nose very well. So he opens his mouth a little bit all the time, but when he's concentrating, what else you should know is his mouth just gets wider and wider as he's working and concentrating. So he's under this table trying to pry this gum off like this. And finally, he breaks one of these loose and it goes, oh. When it comes to decisions, we might say he had a major. Oh, yeah. Last week, we launched this series about making great decisions that lead to a good life. And we saw statistically that you and I will make about 70 decisions every day, about 25,000 decisions every year, and about 2 million decisions in our lifetime. Now, most of those decisions are somewhat small, meaningless decisions, even when it's not that big of a deal. It's like my son. Maybe it's kind of a gross fail. Maybe it's kind of an embarrassing fail, but it doesn't alter your whole life. But there are some decisions that do. 10 years ago, I was just beginning to lead this nonprofit organization, and I was invited to something called these CEO dialogues. And it was where leaders, pastors, CEOs, presidents, of companies, lead pastors. We all met in a room for about 2 days, and we just exchanged best practices of leadership. Well, I was new at this, so I'm sitting in the room with men and women who have been leading for 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years, so I just have my mouth shut. I'm just listening. The only time I'm talking is when I'm asking a question. But I'll never forget what one of the gentlemen said there. One of the men said, you know, as leaders of organizations, you will literally make hundreds of decisions this year, but there will only be 5 or 6 of those decisions that will be critical to the future of the organization. You better figure out which of those 5 or 6, those critical decisions, you better know which ones they are. Now let me turn that around in our context. You and I, statistically, will make about 25,000 decisions this year. And most of those decisions are meaningless. They don't mean that much. What shoes am I going to wear? What road am I going to take to work? What am I going to have for lunch? But there are some decisions that you and I will make this year, small decisions and big decisions, that are life-altering decisions. Life-altering decisions. How do we know that we're making the right decision? Today, we're going to look at one of the greatest tools that we have in our tool bag in making great decisions: wise counsel. And I get why I didn't get a cheer. It's kind of like preaching on obedience. Yeah, okay, we got a few, thank you, some kind people. You know, you come out, I've never preached a sermon yet on obedience where I come out and said, today we're going to talk about obedience. And people go, woo, I love talking about obedience. No one does that. And it's kind of like that with wise counsel. You all just looked at me. Why? Because, well, it's wise counsel we're talking about. But oh, that we would get this. Oh, that you and I would get this, because you know, if you've lived very many decades, that you and I, we could spend hours and hours and hours standing up here giving testimony to times where we did not listen to wise counsel in our life, and then we could share with everybody the heartache that it brought into our lives. Am I right? Young people, oh, I'll get on my knees if it'll help. I beg you to get this. Young people, I beg you to get this. If you will listen to what we are going to learn today, and you will put that into practice at a young age, you will save yourself from so much heartache in life. Wise counsel. Oh, we desperately need it. So open your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 12. This is a great story. You're going to love this story. 1 Kings chapter 12. If you have a hard copy Bible like I'm holding in my hands, maybe just go to the table of contents. It's probably the easiest way to find 1 Kings. It'll give you the page number. You're going to want to look at this. You're going to want to follow along on your smartphone or your device or your hard copy Bible if you have one. 1 Kings chapter 12. Now, while you're finding it, let me give you a little background or context so you understand what's going on in the story. Solomon, the third king of Israel, has just died. His son Rehoboam is now king. Solomon, near the end of his life, started making a lot of big mistakes. In fact, God actually tells us in here that Solomon's 700 wives and 300 concubines began to lead him astray. There's some people that have never heard these stories. If you're visiting, you just sat up in your chair and you said, whoa, whoa, whoa. Did I hear you right? Did you say 700 wives and 300 concubines? Yes, I did. So we might say in Solomon's life, when it comes to decision making, 700 wives and 300 concubines is a major fail. Did everyone say fail with me? I mean, is there anyone in here that thinks that's a good idea? 700 wives, 300 concubines, they started leading him astray. And one of the things he started doing at the end of his reign is he started building these palaces. I mean, you got to have places to put 700 wives and 300 concubines, and roads, and it started taxing. He started taxing the people more. So he dies, Rehoboam becomes king, and the people come to Rehoboam in the first moments of his reign as king, and they say, would you please lighten the load, the taxes that you've put on us? So we pick up the story. This is such a great story. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 4. Your father, so that people come to Rehoboam, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us. And if you do, we will serve you. Now, what Rehoboam does next seems to indicate that he's going to be doing this good decision-making process. Look at the very next verse. Look at verse 5. Rehoboam answered, go away for 3 days and then come back to me. Remember what that gentleman said in the CEO dialogues? You as leaders will make hundreds of decisions this year, but there will only be 5 or 6 that will be critical to the future of the organization. Rehoboam seems to understand that this is one of those decisions. He seems to understand that he can't make a knee-jerk reaction. He can't just do this based on emotions. He seems to understand that he's going to live with the results of this for his entire reign. So it would seem that he's making a good decision. Keep reading. Verse 6. Then, so he takes his 3 days, gives me 3 days. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. He asked them, how would you advise me to answer these people? So now he's consulting these men that are more seasoned than him. In a sense, you can say he's stepping into a room full of wisdom. Okay, He's making some great decisions, right? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Look at verse 7. They replied, this is what they tell him, these wise men, if today you will be a servant to these people and serve them, do you see a pattern? And give them a favorable answer, they will always be your. See, they don't even realize that they are giving Rehoboam the same advice that Jesus would give 1,000 years later. 1,000 years after this story that we're looking at in 1 Kings chapter 12, Jesus would be on earth here in the flesh. And he is right near the end of his life. The last 3 or 4 years, he's been publicly proclaiming himself as the long-awaited Messiah. He's been doing these miracles. He spent almost every moment of every day with 12 men. We call them the 12 disciples. And near the end of this time, Jesus stops at one point and he looks at these men and he says, we're going to go up to Jerusalem and I'm going to give my life. And this would have been a great time for one of them to maybe put their arm around Jesus and console him. But instead, James and John, brothers, they go get their mommy and they come back to Jesus and they say, Jesus, when you set up your kingdom, can we have a throne on your right and on your left? Jesus is talking about the cross and they're talking about thrones. And then the other 10 come in and they find out what James and John requested and they start fighting. It's like a bunch of school children out there fighting. And I think based on how Jesus responds, they're not mad that James and John were so arrogant. They're mad because James and John thought of it first. And they're a little worried that they may have just lost the throne on the right of Jesus and on the left of Jesus. And while they're fighting, Jesus finally steps in. He says, stop. You guys have this all backwards. You're thinking and acting like the systems of this world. See, the systems of this world are kiss up and kick down cultures. Kiss up and kick down situations at work, right? And that's what most of us work in, right? Most of you work in cultures or situations that are kiss up and kick down. And Jesus is saying, not so among you. If you want to claim to be my follower, then you're going to serve others. In fact, Jesus will say, even the Son of Man, he's talking about himself, even God in the flesh, myself, the Son of Man, came to earth not to be served, but to. So 1,000 years before Jesus utters those words, this very wise counsel are sitting in a room with Rehoboam. They're saying, listen, Rehoboam, if you will serve these people, it's not going to be easy at times. I know we're asking you to do the hard thing, but if you will serve these people, they will be loyal to you. Great advice. Look at verse 8. But I always tell people when you're studying the Bible, when you're reading the Bible, look for the big buts in Scripture. There's a lot of big buts in Scripture. This is a gigantic, huge, big but. Big buts in Scripture will teach you a lot. This is a big but. But Rehoboam just got done saying, he was in a room with people that were saying, oh, if you will serve them, they will be loyal to you. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. We might say at this point in his decision-making, it is a major. He's leaving the room of wisdom because he didn't like what they told him, and he's walking down the hallway, if you will, and going into this room of friends who we'll find out are fools. Oh, if he would have listened to his dad. Solomon actually wrote in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 15, Rehoboam's father wrote these words, the way of fools seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice. If only Rehoboam had listened to the words of his father. Listen, right next to verse 8, if you have a hard copy Bible and you don't mind writing in it, right next to verse 8, in all capital letters, you need to write the word stupid. Stupid. So you can get bad advice from anyone, anywhere. You can get bad advice from your lifelong trusted companion. 2-3 weeks ago, my wife and I were in Hawaii. We were visiting our son. He's stationed there in the Marine Corps. Tough place to be stationed, right? he's there with his wife and their 3 children. They just had a new little baby boy, so we got to go hold our new little grandson. And we're there visiting them, but we found out something interesting. They're on the windward side. This is where he's stationed, on the windward side of this island. And there's something very unique that happens 10 days after every full moon. 10 days after every full moon on this little island, these things called Portuguese man-of-war start floating up to the shore. So you'll see a picture of them on the screen, and they look so cute, right? It looks like, it's so pretty and cute, and it's kind of blue, and it looks squishy, and no. They have tentacles, and they are painful. So we're at the beach one day, and my wife gets stung by one. One wraps around her leg, and I can see she's in major pain. She's up on the beach. She's got a handful of sand, and she's just grinding her leg with sand, just trying to get the burn and the sting out. Well, then my son and I are walking out of the water, and my son notices a Portuguese man-of-war floating in the water. We're about knee deep. He tries to push me. If you know anything about my son and I, this defines our entire relationship. He tries to push me into the Portuguese man-of-war. But when he pushes me, he stumbles backwards into he gets stung. So now he's up on shore, my wife and him, and they're both, I can see it is painful. I mean, they're like, ow, 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 and they're scraping themselves with sand. Well, 2 days later, my wife gets stung again. So she's on the beach talking about how painful it is, and I say to her, I'm like, man, I kind of want to know what it feels like, and these words escape her lips. Just go let one sting you. No. You can get bad advice from almost anyone. Now, honestly, some of the wisest advice I get is from my wife, so I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. But the truth is you can get bad advice from almost anyone, sometimes especially your childhood friends. I heard someone say your wife. Man, I bet he's going to take an elbow. Yeah. No, I meant from your friends. Yeah, you can even get bad advice from friends, which is what Rehoboam does. He has the wisdom of these seasoned men, but he goes down the hallway and he goes in this room with these foolish guys. And look what they tell him. Look at verse 10. Oh, this is stupid. Verse 10. The young men who had grown up with him replied, well, these people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. So they're stating the facts. Now look at this. Now tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. I don't even know what that means. I mean, I guess that's trash talking in 1000 BC or something. Verse 11, my father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. So yeah, this is what they're saying. They're going, listen, Rehoboam, what you need to do is you need to go out and power up, and you go out and tell those people, yo, you think my daddy was tough. You think my pops had power. I have way more power than him. If he whipped you, I'll beat you with chains. Great advice. No, that's a major fail. In fact, next to verse 8, you wrote the word stupid. Put a little arrow down to verse 11. This is stupid advice. And once again, Rehoboam would have done well if he would have listened to what his father wrote just one generation before him. In Proverbs chapter 14, verse 7, Solomon said, stay away from a fool. Don't go into this room. Why? For you will not find knowledge on their lips. Run from fools. So, a little quiz. Yay. Little quiz for you, okay? It's a really easy quiz. Everybody gets an A+ as long as you participate, all right? We're going to just review the story really quick. Was this a good decision or a bad decision, okay? So, Rehoboam becomes king. He's confronted with this huge decision, and he says, time out, I need a little time to think. Good decision or bad decision? Good decision. Everybody has A+ so far, right? Okay, now, he in these 3 days where he's going to take a break, he walks down the hallway, so to speak, and enters this room and speaks to these seasoned, wise men. Good decision or bad decision? Good decision. Everybody still has A+. Big but, he doesn't stay here. He doesn't like the advice they give, so he leaves, and in a sense, he walks down the hall to this room and listens or gets advice from his friends. Good decision or bad decision? Terrible decision. In fact, so terrible, let me just finish the story for you. This decision, based on his foolish friend's advice, would actually split the kingdom, And to this day, 3,000 years later, the kingdom of Israel has never really been brought back together like it was at that time. Because he listened to some foolish advice, 3,000 years later, we are still feeling the effects of that. See, this was Rehoboam's problem. In his decision-making process, he started doing this thing called confirmation bias. And unfortunately, you and I probably do it more than we want to admit. Confirmation bias is when you go out and you ask someone for advice, but you're really not looking for advice. You just want someone to agree with the decision that you've already made. See, the truth is that most people don't want truth. They just want someone to tell them that whatever they believe is truth. Did you get that? Most people don't want truth. They just want someone to tell them that whatever they believe is truth. Most people don't want advice. They just want someone to agree with the decision that they've already made. You know what I'm talking about. You've had it happen to you before. Someone has come to you, they've asked you for your advice, you give them advice, and then they go do the exact opposite of what you suggested, and you recognize they already knew what they were going to do. They're just trying to get a circle of people around them that will agree with them. It's confirmation bias. And we can all be in danger of that. Rehoboam did it. Here's the lesson for us. When it comes to decisions, you better pay attention to who you pay attention to. When it comes to decisions, you better pay attention to who you pay attention to. But that begs the question, how do we know? How do we know when we're making a decision? Are we getting wise counsel or foolish counsel? How do we know? Let me just share three quick principles about wise counsel. Principle number one, wise counsel won't always tell you what you want to hear. Wise counsel won't always tell you what you want to hear. Wise counsel won't always tell you what you want to hear. If the people in your life, the people where you get advice from, if they always agree with you, I would suggest that you're asking advice from people pleasers at best, or at worst, you have some fools giving you advice. Wise counsel won't always tell you what you want to hear. See, back up in the story from Rehoboam, and you back up 3 generations to a guy named King Saul. Saul was the very first king of Israel. The nation of Israel is one of the most powerful nations in the world at that time, so we might say that Saul is one of the most powerful men in the world at that time. Well, later in his life, Saul began to make a lot of big mistakes as well. And one of these mistakes he makes is when the prophet Samuel comes to Saul, and Samuel says, Saul, you're going to fight the Amalekites, and I want you to know that I heard clearly from God that God is telling you to wipe everything out. Wipe out all of the cattle, all of the sheep, all of the goats, all of the camels. Wipe it all out. Now understand, in warfare in those days, this was totally opposite of what they would usually do. The way you paid your men, your military men usually, is when you defeated a city or defeated an army, whatever you took from them, you would split up amongst your men. So in this case, Samuel is saying, God is telling you this time, wipe it all out. So Saul's like, got it. Saul goes, he defeats the Amalekites. He comes back, Samuel meets him on a road. And so picture the scene. You know, Saul, the Bible tells us, was a head taller than anybody else. He looked like a king. He sounded like a king. I imagine he's probably riding on a white horse, you know, and he's coming up the road on his white, this is riding a horse, if you're wondering what I'm doing, okay? He's coming up the road on this white horse, and he looks kingly, and Samuel comes out to meet him, and Samuel says, Saul, did you do what God said? And Saul says, I did everything that God said. What, Saul? Yes, I did everything that God said. Saul, if you did everything that God said, then what is that sound I'm hearing, the bleating of sheep? Oh, I kept some of the best sheep and some of the best cattle because I was going to make a sacrifice to God. Wise counsel won't always tell you what you want to hear. Remember, Saul is one of the most powerful men in the world at this time. The higher you go in power, the higher you go in leadership, the less you're going to hear. The higher you go in leadership, the less people are going to be honest and transparent with you. Saul's one of the most powerful men in the world. Samuel's standing on the side of this road with Saul. And he says, Saul, Obedience is better than sacrifice. And at that moment, everyone who would have been standing in earshot would have been like, ooh. But then he takes it up another notch and he goes, Saul, your disobedience, your rebellion against God is like witchcraft to him, and you're going to lose your kingdom. Here's what I don't want us to miss. Don't miss this. Samuel was not telling Saul what Saul wanted to hear. Samuel was telling Saul what Saul needed to hear. Did you get that? Samuel was not telling Saul what Saul wanted to hear. Samuel was telling Saul what Saul needed to hear. And that's what wise counsel will do in your life and my life. They won't just tell us what we want to hear. They'll tell us what we need to hear. Principle number 2, wise counsel is always going to reflect God's best for us. Wise counsel is always, all caps, always going to reflect what God's best is for us. Wise counsel is always going to reflect what God's best is for us. But what does that mean? What is God's best for us? If you're a note taker, write down Romans 8, verse 29. Write that down, look it up later. I get asked this question maybe more than almost any question. How do we know what God's plan for our life is? You've been there? If I only knew what God's plan for my life is, it'd make it so much. If God would just tell me, He has. I'm going to tell you right now what God's plan for your life is. And what God's plan for my life is. Romans 8:29 spells it out very, very clearly. God's number one goal for you and me is to make us more like Jesus. That's God's plan for your life. That's God's plan for my life. That's His number one goal for you and His number one goal for me, is to make us more like Jesus. So wise counsel is always going to reflect God's best for you. What does that mean? They're going to reflect whatever will make you more like Jesus. And how many people in here know that that's not always comfortable? Right? To make you more like Jesus and to make me more like Jesus, sometimes that's uncomfortable. And wise counsel will lead you down that path. Third principle, wise counsel are people who've been where you need to go. Wise counsel are people who've been where you need to go. Wise counsel are people who have been where you need to go. Think of the Rehoboam story. He goes into this room, if you will, with people who have been down that road. He's brand new as king, and he goes into this room, and he's meeting with people who have been down that road. Wise decision, big but he leaves. This one, I'm passionate about this one. And the reason I'm passionate about this principle is because it's my life. It's my life story. See, I come from a very broken past, and I remember my sophomore year in high school. I'm a young man, and I remember looking at the statistics and being so overwhelmed. I'm a young man, and I'm sitting on some steps, and I remember weeping because I realized statistically I didn't have a chance. I dreamed, even as a sophomore, of having a wife someday that I loved, of having a family and being a father. I dreamed of those things, but I realized that statistically I didn't have a chance. Statistically, I was going to be divorced. Statistically, I was going to be a terrible father. And the hope when I realized that God hates those kind of statistics. God loves to step in and go, those are meaningless. I don't care how many generations are broken. You can stop it. With God, we can stop it. But what I learned as a sophomore in high school is this principle: wise counsel are people who've been where you need to go. If I wanted to learn what it meant to be a good husband, I didn't get that example. I needed to go find people who had great marriages and watch. So I found people who had great marriages, who had been married 3 years or 5 years or 10 years or 30 years, and I watched how that man treated that woman or how that man talked to that woman, and I learned from them about what it meant to be a good husband. I watched people that had children that loved and respected their parents, and the parents loved and respected their children, and I watched how those people interacted with their children to learn what it means to be a good father. What was I doing? Wise counsel are people who've been where you need to go. I knew I wanted to go there, but I didn't know how. So go find people that do. That we would get this. That we would do this. See, this is why I care so much about this issue about wise counsel. I get, like I said at the beginning, that it's kind of like a sermon about obedience. Obedience, yay. Wise counsel, woo-hoo. But no, we need to get this because you show me the 5 people you spend most of your time with. You show me the 5 people who have the greatest influence in your life, and I'll show you who you're going to be in 5 years. You show me the 5 people you spend most of your time with. You show me the 5 people who have the greatest influence in your life, and I'll show you who you're going to be in 5 years. That's who you'll be. And this is why God is saying, when it comes to your decision making, you better make sure you're choosing wisdom. You better make sure you're surrounding yourself with wise people that are influencing you. Let me finish with this quick story. So 14 years ago, when I first moved down to the Phoenix area, I had the privilege of sitting down with this leadership guru, this guy that goes all over the country teaching leadership classes. And it was just he and I for lunch. And so I asked him, I said, what do you think are 3 of the most important principles of being a great leader? Now, his answer goes way beyond leadership. That's why I'm sharing it today. His answer, I would say, it goes more into not just being a great leader, but being a great person or making great decisions. So I said, what are the 3 most important principles? I don't remember all 3, but I remember 2 of the 3. And the first one he said is self-awareness. You can't be a great leader without self-awareness. Or I would say you cannot make great decisions without self-awareness. But this is the one I want us to focus on, the second one. He said you cannot be a great leader, or I would say you cannot be a great person, or I would say you can't be a good follower of Jesus, or I would say you cannot make great decisions without truth tellers in your life. See, he was talking about it from the perspective of leadership. Remember, the higher you go in leadership, the less you're going to hear. The higher you go in leadership, the less truth tellers you're going to have in your life. So you better have some truth tellers in your life. But I would say that's true of every single one of us. We better have those people that can tell us not what we want to hear, but what we need to hear. I'm going to close in prayer. I want to just ask if you would just close your eyes, and I want you to picture in front of you a sheet of paper, and there's 3 names on it. And in your imagination, I just want you to picture the 3 names of the people who have the greatest influence in your life. What are those names? Number 1, number 2, number 3. These are the people who have the greatest influence in your life. Picture those names. Now, for some of you, maybe 1 or 2 of those names, if you're honest, they're not wise people, they're fools. And you need to make a really, really difficult decision. But I'm telling you, if you have the courage to make this decision, it will change your life for the better. When you, in your imagination, look at those 3 names, some of you are looking at those names and you're going, wow, God, thank you. I can't even believe the kind of people you've brought into my life. And if that's the case, today before you go to sleep, would you just send them a text message or an email and just encourage them and say, thank you for being wise counsel in my life. God, I pray that we at Cornerstone can be marked as people that have the humility to allow people to speak into our lives, to allow wise counsel in our lives, that allow people to not just tell us what we want to hear, but what we need to hear. God, I pray that we at Cornerstone would be marked as people that continue to seek you and learn from you so that we can be wise counsel to others. We love you, Jesus. Amen.